A folded note landed beside the wine glass of the most dangerous man in the city, placed there not by a lawyer, not by a rival, not by anyone with a weapon or a title, but by a black waitress in a white shirt and a black vest who had been invisible in that room for 8 months. Nyla Corin didn't say a word. She didn't flinch. She simply set the note down, stepped back to her station, and waited. Darian Vale, crime architect, untouchable, feared by prosecutors and enemies alike, unfolded it, looked at what was inside for exactly 11 seconds, and then did something no one in that room had ever seen him do. He went completely still. He set the note face down on the white linen, and without raising his voice, without turning around, he told his men to shut it all down. Every guest removed, every exit sealed, every staff member cleared, except one. The waitress who said nothing had just moved the most powerful man in the underworld, and she hadn't even spoken yet. Nyla Corin had spent 3 years becoming someone nobody looked at twice. Not out of timidity, out of strategy. Since the night her mother vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing except a locked journal with a single name written on the inside cover, Nyla had learned that the most dangerous thing a woman without allies could do was make herself easy to dismiss. So she did. She took a job at Meridian, one of the city's most exclusive private dining rooms, and she became the best waitress on the floor, quiet, precise, forgettable. For 8 months, she refilled glasses and memorized faces and studied the rhythms of a room that hosted men who built their entire power on the assumption that the people serving them couldn't hear, couldn't understand, and certainly couldn't matter. She was watching one man, Darian Vale, the name her mother had written down, the only thread she had left. She didn't know if he was a monster or a missing piece. She only knew she had to get close enough to ask. She had one photograph, one question, and one chance to put them in front of him before the man standing in the shadows behind her, the one who had been watching her run this plan for months, the one whose face she had never seen clearly, decided he had learned enough. What Nyla didn't know yet was that the note she slid across that table wasn't just a question. It was the match, and the room she had spent 8 months memorizing was already full of gasoline. The Tuesday dinner rush at Meridian had its own rhythm, and Nyla knew every beat of it. She knew which tables turned at 7:15 and which ones lingered until 10. She knew that the sommelier always overpoured for the couple in the corner booth because the husband tipped in cash and the sommelier had a student loan. She knew that the manager checked the reservation list 3 times before a high-profile arrival, once at 4, once at 6, once at 6:50, and that the third check always made his jaw tighten in a way that told her exactly who was coming before she ever saw the car. Tonight his jaw was tight. She kept moving. Water refill at table 7. Bread service at table 3. The dining room at Meridian was the kind of place that made ordinary people feel important and important people feel untouchable. Low amber lighting, white linen, the soft insistence of a string quartet that cost more per hour than Nyla made in a week. She had learned to move through it like she belonged there, which was the first and most important thing she had taught herself 8 months ago when she walked in for her interview with a resume she had spent 2 weeks engineering to look exactly right. She had a culinary degree from a university she'd attended on a partial scholarship and never used for cooking. She had 3 years of fine dining experience she had assembled the hard way. 6 months at a hotel restaurant, 4 months at a private club in the financial district, a brutal stretch at a prefix in the South End, where the head chef threw plates and the turnover rate was catastrophic. She had done all of it deliberately, methodically, the way she did everything since the morning she woke up to find her mother's apartment empty, her mother's phone disconnected, and nothing left behind except a coat hanging by the door and a small locked journal in the coat's inside pocket. The journal had taken her 11 days to open without damaging it. She had read it cover to cover 4 times. Most of it was ordinary, grocery lists, appointment reminders, fragments of thought in her mother's compressed handwriting. But on the inside cover, written in pen that pressed harder than everything else on the page, as if her mother had needed the words to stay, a single name. Darian Vale. No explanation. No context. Just the name, and beneath it, a date from 4 years ago, 8 months before her mother disappeared. Nyla had spent 3 months trying to find out who he was through public channels, the way a careful person did it. Then she had spent another 6 months understanding that public channels told you almost nothing about a man like Darian Vale. only what he allowed to be known, which was just enough to be unreachable. The legitimate side of him was impeccable. The rest existed in the spaces between documented facts, in the way people's voices changed when his name came up, in the particular silence of anyone who had ever done business with him and been asked about it afterward. She had taken the only approach left. She had gotten into the room. The reservation had been under a shell company, the way it always was. She had learned this in her third week on the floor, that the name on the booking meant nothing, that the table meant everything. Table 1. The corner position with sight lines to both the entrance and the kitchen. She had served it 14 times in 8 months, always efficiently, always without incident, always without Darian Vale looking at her directly for longer than the half-second it took to register that she was not a threat. She was a very good waitress. She had made sure of it. The manager checked his reservation list a third time. Nyla moved to the service window and looked out at the street, because she had learned which direction the car came from, and she needed a moment that no one in the dining room could see. The black sedan made the turn onto Meridian's block, unhurried, completely certain of its welcome. For 8 months, she had felt nothing in this moment except focus. Tonight, standing at the service window with her hands perfectly still at her sides, she felt something she had not budgeted for. She was terrified. She had rehearsed the delivery so many times that her hands didn't shake. That was the thing she noticed most. Not the noise of the room, not the weight of what she was about to do, but the steadiness of her own fingers as she folded the note one final time and slipped it beneath the edge of his bread plate. A small movement, the kind she made 40 times a night. Nobody at the surrounding tables looked up. The sommelier was mid-pour at the far end of the room. Darian Vale was finishing a sentence to the man on his right, and Nyla was already stepping back toward her station before he reached for it. She did not watch him open it. She had decided this weeks ago that watching would make her visible, and visible was the one thing she could not afford in the 3 seconds between delivery and reaction. So she turned away, refilled a water glass that didn't need refilling at table 4, and counted her own heartbeats the way she had taught herself to do in the months when sleep had stopped coming reliably. 1, 2, 3. At 7, the room changed. She felt it before she heard it. A shift in the ambient noise, the way a conversation breaks off mid-sentence when something interrupts the frequency. Then the manager was moving. Then Darian's men were on their feet. And then the quiet, controlled machinery of an exit she had never witnessed before began to operate with a precision that told her this had happened before in other rooms, for other reasons, and that every person in Meridian's employ had been briefed on exactly what to do when it did. Guests were guided out with the kind of gracious efficiency that made it feel like an upgrade rather than a removal. Staff followed. The string quartet packed up without being told twice. In 4 minutes, the dining room was empty of everyone except Nyla, who had not moved from her station, because leaving had never been part of what she came here to do. The note was still face down on the table. Darian Vale was gone from the room. She waited. The photograph inside the note was the size of a playing card. She had found it sewn into the lining of her mother's coat. Not tucked, not slipped, but sewn, with small careful stitches that her mother had placed there deliberately, at some point. For some reason Nyla had spent 3 years trying to understand. It showed her mother at 19, a version of her Nyla only knew from other photographs. Younger than memory, unguarded in a way she had rarely been in life. She was at some kind of function, a formal event judging by the room in the background, standing beside a man who was perhaps 40 at the time, sharp-jawed, with pale eyes and the beginning of the controlled stillness that had since become his defining quality. They were laughing, both of them, genuinely, the way people laugh when they have forgotten for a moment that anyone is watching. It was the most human Nyla had ever seen either of them look. She didn't know what the photograph meant. She had turned it over hundreds of times, literally, in her hands, and constantly, in her thinking, and she had never arrived at a conclusion that felt complete. She only knew that her mother had hidden it carefully and kept it close, which meant it mattered, and that Darian Vale's name had appeared in her mother's handwriting 8 months before she disappeared, which meant he was connected to whatever had happened. What she had never allowed herself to consider, because allowing it would have required her to restructure everything she had spent 3 years building, was the possibility that the connection was not sinister, that the photograph was not evidence of something done to her mother, that it was evidence of something lost. The door at the back of the dining room opened. Darian Vale walked back in alone. No men behind him. No intermediary. He crossed the room without hurrying and sat down in the chair directly across from her. Not at the head of the table, not at a remove, but across, at a distance that was almost ordinary. He set the note on the linen between them, face up, the photograph visible. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't name. Then he said, "How long have you had this?" She had prepared for threats. She had prepared for dismissal, for lawyers, for the particular cold efficiency of a man who made problems disappear before they became inconvenient. She had prepared, in her worst imagining of this moment, for something that would require her to leave the building quickly and not look back. She had not prepared for this. He was looking at the photograph the way you looked at something you had been searching for, not with suspicion, but with the careful, almost frightened attention of a man who needed to be certain before he let himself believe it. His finger moved to the edge of the image and stopped without touching it, as if contact might change something irreversible. "How long?" he said again, quietly. 3 years. I found it the day after she disappeared." Something crossed his face that he did not fully control. A tightening around the eyes, a compression at the jaw, brief, and then it was gone, replaced by the stillness she had watched across 14 Tuesday evenings. But she had seen it. She filed it the way she filed everything, and felt the first small fracture form in the architecture of what she had believed about why she was here. He asked where she had found it. She told him about the coat, the sewn lining, the stitches too deliberate to be accidental. He listened without interrupting, without signaling to anyone, without performing the controlled authority she had studied for 8 months. He was simply listening, like a man who had been waiting a very long time for someone to say these words in this order. "Your name was in her journal," Nyla said. "Inside the cover." He nodded once, not surprised, confirming. "When did she write it?" "4 years ago. 8 months before Nyla stopped. She had said the word so many times in her own thinking that it had lost its weight. But something about this room, this table, this man's expression made it feel new and terrible. Before she was gone, he looked at the photograph again. Then he looked at Nyla, really looked, for the first time in 14 Tuesday evenings, the way she had been careful to prevent, and she felt something she had not budgeted for. Not assessment, not the cataloging of a threat or a variable, something closer to recognition. The particular attention of a person who is looking for something familiar in a stranger's face and finding it. "You look like her," he said, around the eyes. It was the wrong thing to say to someone who had spent 3 years not falling apart in rooms that required her to function, and it very nearly worked. She pressed her hands flat against the table and breathed through it. "What was she to you?" It came out as a statement. It was the reason she had spent 8 months learning which direction his car came from. He was quiet for long enough that she believed he wouldn't answer. The empty dining room held the silence generously. It was built for exactly this kind of privacy, and right now it was giving them all of it. Somewhere in the building, Merrick Thorne was watching through something. She was almost certain of it. None of that existed inside this particular moment. There was only the white linen and the photograph, and this man who was not what she had spent 3 years constructing him to be. He was grieving. She could see it clearly now, the way shapes emerged once your eyes adjusted to low light. It had been present in every line of his stillness, in the way he had not touched the photograph, in the quality of his silence, which was not the silence of power but of loss that had exhausted every other form it once took. She recognized it because she had been living inside the same silence for 3 years, and she knew exactly what it looked like from the inside. He looked at the photograph one final time. When he spoke, his voice had dropped below the register that made rooms rearrange themselves around him. What was left was something quieter and older and entirely unguarded. "Her name," he said, "was Kala." He said it the way you said the name of someone you were terrified of losing twice. The private room was off the main corridor, past a door that looked like a wall panel until Darian touched a specific point on the frame and it opened inward. No dramatic reveal. Just the quiet functionality of a man who had long since stopped finding his own arrangements remarkable. He gestured once, and Nyla walked through, because leaving was still not part of what she had come here to do. The room held a table, 4 chairs, and a single lamp that cast everything in warm, specific light. No windows. She noted this without reacting to it. He sat across from her, the photograph between them again, and he told her what he knew in the same stripped register he had used to say her mother's name. Nyla Vale had spent the better part of a decade trying to disappear from the life her father's name had built around her. Not bitterly. Darian was precise about this, in the way of a man correcting a record he had rehearsed many times. She had not hated him. She had simply understood, with the particular clarity of someone who had grown up watching power operate at close range, that the only way to build something of her own was to put distance between herself and everything his name touched. So she had, quietly, methodically, in increments. She had changed her surname. She had moved 3 times in 4 years. She had constructed a life that was entirely and deliberately hers. And then, 3 years ago, she had stopped being reachable. He had resources no law enforcement agency in the city could access. He had called in obligations that predated the careers of the men who owed them. He had turned over every surface he could find, and beneath none of them had he found anything that told him where Nyla Vale had gone or why. What he had found, 3 months into the search, was a wall, not a dead end, but a wall, the specific kind that someone builds on purpose to stop a particular person from looking further. He had been dismantling that wall for 3 years. He had not yet reached the other side. Nyla listened to all of this without speaking. She was processing the structural revision it required. Not emotionally, not yet. She could not afford yet, but architecturally. Every assumption she had built her 8 months around was load-bearing, and this conversation was removing supports she had not identified as supports until they were gone. Darian Vale had not taken her mother. Darian Vale was looking for her mother. These two facts could not coexist with the framework she had arrived in, and one of them had to give. She already knew which one. On the other side of the building, in a narrow service corridor with a sight line to the private room's door, Merrick Thorne stood with his phone face down in his jacket pocket and watched through a strip of reinforced glass no wider than his hand. He had known who the waitress was since her 3rd shift. It had not been difficult. A background check run through the right channels. A name cross-referenced against a search he had maintained quietly for 3 years. A face compared against a photograph he had studied enough times to recognize the bone structure across a dining room in low amber light. Nyla Corin, 26. Daughter of a woman who had made the mistake, 3 years ago, of discovering something she could not unknow and making the further mistake of believing that loyalty to a name would protect her when she brought it forward. He had dealt with that problem carefully. He was good at careful. What he had not done, what he had been deciding, across 8 months of Tuesday evenings and bread service and water refills, was deal with the daughter. He had watched her work the room, had watched her watch Darian, had assessed, over weeks, exactly how much she knew and how far she had traced it, and whether the thread in her hand was long enough to reach him. He had let her run because a moving person revealed more than a stopped one. Now she was in a private room with Darian Vale, and Darian was talking. Merrick looked at the closed door for a moment longer. Then he made a decision about how much time he had left. He asked for the sample with the same quiet efficiency he applied to everything, and Nyla gave it because she had run out of reasons not to. A swab, handled by a man who appeared from a side door and disappeared back through it without speaking. Darian made a call in the corridor while she stayed in the private room and listened to him speak in a low, clipped cadence to someone who was clearly awake at this hour specifically for calls like this one. For hours, he said, when he came back in. He did not explain what happened in 4 hours. He did not need to. She understood, and her understanding of it meant something she was not ready to look at directly. That this was not the first time he had done this, that he had a standing infrastructure for exactly this kind of confirmation, that somewhere in his network there existed a reference sample against which hers was about to be compared. A last confirmed trace of Nyla Vale, preserved in a laboratory by a man who had refused, for 3 years, to close the question. He sat down. She sat down. And then they waited. The first 20 minutes had a kind of forward momentum to it. Small, practical exchanges about what the process involved, how reliable the turnaround was, the specific language of two people managing a situation that was too large to approach directly. Nyla asked questions she mostly already knew the answers to, because the asking was easier than the silence. Darian answered them with the patient thoroughness of a man who understood that she was not asking about science. Then the practical exchanges ran out. The last 20 minutes were the stillest Nyla had ever sat through, and she had sat through some very still rooms in 3 years of looking for her mother. She became aware of the lamp, the grain of the table, the way Darian Vale held himself in repose. Not relaxed, never fully relaxed, but contained, his hands resting on the table in front of him with a deliberate quality, as if stillness were something he had to choose rather than something that came naturally. She wondered if he was afraid. She thought he probably was. In whatever register fear operated in a man who had spent 40 years ensuring that almost nothing could touch him. She was afraid too. She had been afraid since the service window, since the headlights of his car, turning onto the block. What she hadn't identified until this room, this table, this particular silence, was what exactly she was afraid of. She was afraid he was telling the truth. Because if he was telling the truth, then the architecture of 3 years collapsed. The version of this story in which Darian Vale was the answer, the source, the threat, the end of the search, dissolved entirely. And what replaced it was a much larger darkness with a shape she couldn't yet see clearly. His phone lit up on the table between them. He looked at it for a moment without moving. Then he picked it up, read what was on the screen, and set it face down. The silence after that was different. It had weight and direction. Nyla looked at the surface of the table and understood, before he said anything, what the message had confirmed. She had known, she realized, somewhere below the level of strategy and planning and 3 years of careful architecture, since the moment he had said her mother's name in that stripped and careful voice. She never told me you existed, Nyla said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. Darian was quiet for long enough that she thought he was choosing whether to answer or choosing how. When he spoke, there was something careful in it. Careful, and beneath the careful, something that had been carrying its own weight for a very long time. She wouldn't have, he said. She was protecting you. He did not say from what. Nyla looked at him across the table. This man who was, according to a laboratory and a 3-year-old sample, and every instinct she had suppressed for 8 months, her grandfather, and understood that she was still, despite everything, entirely alone in a room she did not know how to leave safely. The confirmation changed everything. It resolved nothing. Darian had stepped out to make calls, and for the first time in hours Nyla was moving through the building without an escort. Not unsupervised, she understood that, but physically alone in the way that felt, after the compression of the private room, like something close to air. The corridor ran alongside the kitchen, which was dark and shut down for the night, the steel surfaces catching the emergency lighting in long pale strips. She was walking without a destination, which was something she almost never allowed herself, because purposeful movement was harder to question than aimless movement, and she had spent 8 months in this building being impossible to question. Old habit. She kept it anyway. Merrick Thorne appeared from a side passage the way he did everything. She would later think, without announcement, without urgency, as though he had simply always been standing there, and she had only just noticed. "Miss Corin," he said. She stopped. She kept her face neutral in the way she had practiced, which was easier now than it had been 8 months ago and harder now than it had been an hour ago, because the evening had used up more of her reserves than she had budgeted for. "Mr. Thorne." He fell into step beside her rather than blocking her path, which she noted as a choice. He was a tall man, composed, with the particular economy of movement that came from a long professional habit of not wasting anything. Not words, not gesture, not the implications of physical space. He did not crowd her. He maintained exactly the distance of a collegial conversation. "This must be an overwhelming night," he said. Not unkindly. "I'm managing. I imagine you are." He glanced at her sideways with an expression that was almost warm. "You've been managing for 8 months. That kind of discipline doesn't collapse in one evening." She said nothing. She had learned, in the rooms of the last 3 years, that silence was almost always the correct response to a sentence designed to make you feel understood. He let the silence sit for a moment, then moved through it cleanly. He was looking for her mother too, he said. Had been for some time. And he believed, this was the word he used, carefully, believed, that he knew where she was. Not suspected, not hoped, knew, in the operational sense of the word, the kind of knowing that came with a location and a set of verifiable details he was prepared to share. Nyla kept walking at the same pace. In exchange, he continued, he was asking for something straightforward. That she speak to Darian before the night went further. That she tell him the photograph had been a misidentification, that the woman in it was not her mother, that the resemblance had led her to a wrong conclusion, that there was no connection to follow. The DNA result could be attributed to a processing error, which happened, which was documented, which any laboratory would confirm upon challenge. It would require one conversation, perhaps 10 minutes of her time. And then, he said, she would have what she came for. His manner throughout was entirely reasonable. There was no threat in it, no edge, no performance of menace. He spoke the way a man spoke when he believed his position was simply correct and was giving the other person the courtesy of understanding it before she agreed. She had met this manner before, in different rooms, on different subjects, and she had learned that it was frequently the most dangerous version of a person, not the one who threatened, but the one who had already decided and was being patient about it. She smiled. It was the professional smile, the one she had worn for 8 months at Meridian, and it fit her face as naturally as breathing. "That's very helpful," she said. "Let me think about it." He nodded, satisfied, and excused himself back into the building's geography. Nyla walked to the end of the corridor, turned into a small alcove near the service entrance, and stood very still for 60 minutes. She thought about one thing only. Merrick Thorne knew where her mother was. He had known, perhaps, for some time. And in 10 years of being Darian Vale's most trusted man, 10 years of access, 10 years of standing at his right shoulder in every room, he had said nothing. The question was not whether Merrick was dangerous. The question was what her mother had found out that made her dangerous to him. Darian had given her a room on the second floor with a window that faced the interior courtyard. Not a guest room exactly. More like a room that had been kept ready for a category of person who needed to be close, but not integrated, present, but not embedded. She had slept for 3 hours, which was more than she expected, and woken at 5:15 to the specific quality of early morning silence that felt less like quiet and more like the building holding its breath. She spent the first hour simply observing. This was the only skill she had that hadn't been learned from a book or a plan or 3 years of deliberate research, the capacity to watch her room until it revealed its own logic. She had developed it in the months after her mother disappeared, sitting in the apartment going through every object, every surface, every pattern of habit until the shape of a life became visible in its own negative space. She had refined it across 8 months of dining room floors. She did not have training. She had attention, which in her experience was rarer and more useful. The household ran on a schedule that was almost military in its consistency. Staff rotations at 6, 8, and noon. A communications terminal in the study off the main corridor, accessible to 3 people based on the keycard logs she could see from the landing: Darian, his personal assistant, and Merrick. The assistant used it in the mornings. Darian used it in the evenings. Merrick used it at irregular hours, which was itself a pattern, because irregular in a house this disciplined was a choice rather than an accident. The access she shouldn't have had came from a tablet left charging on the kitchen counter, logged into the household's administrative system by someone who had stepped away for what they expected to be 2 minutes. She did not touch the tablet. She read what was visible on the screen from a standing distance of 4 feet while she poured herself coffee, and what was visible was enough to understand that the column she was looking at was not the household accounts. The names meant nothing to her at first. She cataloged them anyway, the way she cataloged everything, committing them to the compressed shorthand she had developed for exactly this kind of retention. 8 names across entries spanning 14 months. Financial movements attached to each, routed in a way that suggested the routing itself was the point. Layered, redirected, designed to arrive somewhere clean. She spent the rest of the morning in her room with a notepad, reconstructing what she had seen and cross-referencing it against 3 years of research she carried in her memory, because she had never trusted it to anything that could be found. By early afternoon, 6 of the 8 names had resolved into something she recognized. They were people who had disappeared. Not violently, not visibly, the kind of disappearances that looked, from the outside, like decisions. A woman who had left a custody dispute and never collected her children. A man who had been scheduled to testify in a financial case and simply stopped being reachable. A low-level city official who had resigned abruptly and moved abroad, except that no one who knew him had heard from him since. Disappearances that had no obvious author because they had been designed to look like choices rather than removals. She sat with this for a long time. Then she thought about her mother, who had spent years building a life inside the negative space of Darian Vale's name, who had been careful and quiet and deliberate, and had still, somehow, ended up on a list that Nyla was only now able to read because a tablet had been left unattended for 2 minutes in a kitchen. Her mother had found this. Had found Marek's operation running beneath the surface of everything Darian thought he controlled, had understood what it was and what it meant, and had made the decision, her mother's decision, the one she recognized because she had inherited it, to bring it forward rather than stay silent. Marek had removed her before she reached the door. Nyla set down the notepad. She looked at the wall for a moment. The note she had slid across a table had been the beginning of something, but it was not going to be enough to finish it. She had a photograph and a confirmation and a corridor conversation that proved nothing except that Marek was careful. She needed to tell Darian the rest. She found him in the study at the end of the main corridor, standing at the window that overlooked the courtyard with a glass of something he hadn't touched. She knocked on the open door rather than walking in, because 8 months of service industry had made the courtesy automatic, and because some part of her understood that the way she entered this room would set the register for everything that followed. He turned and gestured to the chair across the desk. She sat, and she told him everything. She told him about the tablet, the names, the financial routing she had reconstructed from 2 minutes of reading at a standing distance of 4 feet. She told him about the 6 names she had cross-referenced against 3 years of research she carried in her memory. The disappearances that had been designed to look like decisions, the woman and the witness and the official and the others, the pattern that only became visible when you had enough of the pieces in the same place at the same time. She told him about the corridor conversation with Marek, the offer, the location he claimed to know, the specific shape of a deal that was reasonable on its surface and catastrophic underneath. She told him that her mother had found this, that her mother had been removed before she could bring it forward, that the wall he had spent 3 years unable to dismantle from the outside had been built from the inside, by the man who stood at his right shoulder in every room. She said all of it without stopping, because stopping would have required her to feel it before she had finished delivering it, and she needed to finish first. When she was done, the room was very quiet. Darian stood at the window for a long moment with his back to her. Then he turned, set the untouched glass on the desk, and sat down. "I know," he said. 2 words. Quiet and level and completely without surprise. Nyla looked at him. The thing that moved through her was not clean enough to be called anger. It was broader than that, and older, with 3 years of weight behind it. She kept her voice even because the alternative was not useful. "Then why," she said, "is he still in this building?" Darian's answer was not defensive. That was the thing she would return to afterward, that he did not flinch from it, did not reach for justification or reframe it as strategy. He simply told her the truth in the same stripped register he had used to say her mother's name. In his world, he said, an accusation without proof did not end the accused. It ended the accuser. This was not a philosophical position. It was a structural fact, as load-bearing and immovable as anything else he had spent 40 years constructing. Marek had been building his position inside the organization for a decade, not loudly, not visibly, but thread by thread, dependency by dependency, until dismantling him meant dismantling infrastructure that half of what Darian had built was running on. An unsupported accusation against a man that embedded did not produce a confrontation. It produced a question about the judgment of the man making the accusation, and a question about Darian Vale's judgment, at this point in his life, in this particular ecosystem, was not a question he could survive being asked. So he had waited. He had been constructing, quietly and from a distance, a moment in which Marek would expose himself completely enough that the evidence was not Darian's word but the record itself. He had been waiting for the right pressure point. He looked at her across the desk. He had not, he said, expected the pressure point to walk into his restaurant 8 months ago in a white shirt and a black vest, and spend every 3rd Tuesday learning which direction his car came from. Nyla looked back at him. She understood, sitting in that chair in the study with the courtyard dark outside the window, that she had spent 8 months preparing for a version of this that did not exist. The real version was harder and more specific and required something she had spent 3 years training herself not to do. It required her to not be alone in it. Neither of them said this out loud. Neither of them needed to. It happened the following morning, and it happened fast. She was in the kitchen at 7:15, which had become, across 2 days, the closest thing to a neutral space the building contained. When one of Darian's men appeared in the doorway with an expression that was professionally blank in the way that meant the opposite of blank, and told her that Darian was asking for her in the main room. The main room held 4 people when she arrived. Darian at the head of the table. 2 lieutenants she recognized from the building's rhythms, but had not been introduced to. And Merrick, standing to the left of the window with his hands clasped in front of him and an expression of careful, sorrowful composure that she understood immediately was a performance. Not because it was overdone, but because it was precisely calibrated, which was always the tell. On the table was a file. Printed documents, photographs, what appeared to be financial records and communication logs. Darian's hand rested beside it without touching it, and he was looking at her with the stillness she had identified in Chapter 8 as the most dangerous version of him. Not angry, not reactive, but completely suspended, the way a man looked when he was holding 2 contradictory truths and had not yet decided which one to release. She sat down, because standing would have read as either guilt or aggression, and she looked at the file. It was immaculate. Her name appeared in correspondence with an organization she recognized from 3 years of research as a rival structure to Darian's. A name that should have had no connection to her, but was woven through the documentation with the patient, layered thoroughness of something assembled over time rather than constructed overnight. The photograph, according to a sourced and footnoted analysis included in the file, was a known manipulation technique, a composite or a staged image, used previously in 2 documented cases to compromise the decision-making of older men with unresolved grief. The DNA confirmation had been processed through a laboratory that, per attached records, had been flagged twice in the past 4 years for result irregularities. There was a timeline. There were corroborating details. There was, at the back of the file, a psychological assessment of the technique, its effectiveness, its specific targeting of men whose emotional exposure could be mapped in advance. Darian had been mapped. The file said so clearly, and without editorializing, which was the most damaging way to say anything. 90 minutes passed in which the file was discussed, reviewed, and discussed again, and in which Nyla answered questions with the steady, careful precision of someone who understood that the appearance of composure was the only asset she had left. She could see that the lieutenants had already moved to a conclusion. She could see that Merrick was watching her with the sorrowful attention of a man who had done a difficult thing and was prepared to see it through. She could see that Darian had not yet moved. She read the file 3 times while they talked around her. Not the arguments, the documents themselves, the specific details, the dates and timestamps and location references that formed the connective tissue of the fabrication. She read the way she had read Meridian's dining room for 8 months, not looking for what was there, but for what didn't fit. It was on page 7. A communication log placing Merrick at a specific address at 9:43 on a Thursday evening 14 months ago, cited as evidence of his attempts to investigate Nyla's organization independently. The address was 3 blocks from Meridian. The timestamp was 14 months ago, a Thursday. Nyla had worked every Thursday for 8 months. She had worked them before that, at the restaurant's previous schedule. 14 months ago on a Thursday, Meridian had been closed for a private event that ran until midnight and had required all senior staff to remain on premises. Merrick had been at a table in the dining room. She had served him water. She did not say this out loud. She pulled a piece of paper from the edge of the file, wrote 11 words, and slid it across the table to Darian. He was at Meridian that night. I served him water. She had become, without planning it, the kind of person who communicated in notes. Merrick was not dragged in. That was the detail that mattered most, and Nyla understood it the moment she saw his face as he entered the room. The particular expression of a man who has been calculating on the walkover and has not yet determined whether his calculation is sufficient. An invitation was worse than a summons. A summons told you what they had. An invitation told you nothing, which meant they had enough to be comfortable. He sat down across from the table where the file, his immaculate construction, was laid out in full, with Nyla's 11 words on their piece of paper placed at the center of it like a period at the end of a very long sentence. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Nyla, and she watched him arrive at the understanding that the thing he had underestimated was not Darian's resources or his reach or the loyalty of his lieutenants. It was the patience of a 26-year-old woman who had spent 8 months learning which direction a car came from. She did not watch the rest of it. She had what she needed from the room, and the rest belonged to Darian in a way that she had no claim on and no appetite for. She stood, and she left, and nobody stopped her. In the hours that followed, she was offered things. A financial arrangement, presented by the assistant with the careful language of someone who had done this before, enough to relocate, to rebuild, to construct whatever version of a life she wanted in whatever city made sense. She declined it. A formal security arrangement, which meant in practical terms a name on a list and a number to call, and the specific kind of protection that came from being associated with a man whose name made rooms adjust. She declined most of it and accepted a single element, a contact, one person, reachable if she needed to be reached, because she was not so committed to independence that she would decline something genuinely useful on principle. Her mother had been that committed. She had watched what it cost. Darian presented the last thing himself, in the study, in the same 2 chairs they had occupied the night before. No file between them this time. No photograph. Just the lamp and the table and the particular quality of a conversation that had found its way, across 72 hours, to something neither of them had planned to arrive at. He was going to find her mother, he said. Not as a transaction, not as an exchange for anything she had done or provided. Because Kala was his daughter and Nyla was his granddaughter, and he had spent 40 years ensuring that his name meant something. And what it was going to mean now, what he intended it to mean for whatever time he had left to spend, was that the people who belonged to him did not stay lost. Nyla looked at the table for a moment. She thought about the word belonged, and how it had always felt like a constraint and felt, in this room, in this specific usage, like something else entirely. She said, "All right." 6 weeks later, she walked into Meridian at 10:30 on a Tuesday morning, when the dining room was set for lunch, but not yet populated. She was not in uniform. She wore her own clothes, which were unremarkable, and she sat down at table 1. The corner position, sightlines to the entrance and the kitchen, back naturally oriented toward the interior wall, and ordered coffee from a waitress she had never seen before. She spent 20 minutes watching the room. The exits. The weight distribution of the man near the bar who was standing slightly wrong for someone waiting on a reservation. The new sommelier's eye line, which went to the kitchen door more than was warranted. The ambient patterns of a space she had studied for 8 months from the floor and was now reading from the table. She was still the most observant person in the room. She suspected she always would be. When she left, she placed a folded note under the empty cup. The new waitress found it during the clear. Unfolded it. Read the 7 words written in compressed, careful handwriting. You see more than they think. Don't waste it. By the time she looked up, the door had already closed. Nyla Corin didn't walk into that room with weapons or wealth or a single person in her corner. She walked in with patience, a photograph, and 3 years of paying attention when everyone around her assumed she wasn't. That was enough. Not because the world suddenly became fair, it didn't. But because she refused to let the years she spent being overlooked go to waste. She turned every invisible shift, every ignored moment, every room that forgot she was standing in it into preparation for the one moment that mattered. Here is what this story is really about. The quiet years are never wasted years. The season you spent being underestimated was building something in you that loud people never develop. The ability to see clearly, move precisely, and act when everyone else is still reacting. You have been in rooms that forgot you existed. Good. You were watching. You were learning. And when your moment comes, and it will come, you will be the only one in the room who is ready. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. That means more than you know. If this story moved you, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe so you never miss what's coming next. Your support is what makes these stories possible. See you in the next one.